Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the BoogieBoard Tiki Bar. Today, I am delighted to be joined by JD Miller, who is a chief revenue officer. He's an advisor. He's a sales and marketing leader. And most interestingly now, he's the author of the CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity, which is just about to be released, I believe. JD, is that correct?
January 14th on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, and everywhere great books are sold.
I actually just pre-ordered mine while I was getting ready for this interview, so I know that you can go do that. So all the listeners, go ahead and give a pre-order. But JD,
Fantastic.
thanks so much for doing this. How is winter in Chicago?
You know, it is winter in Chicago right now, and we've already had our first snowfall. We had about 4 inches fell, but it all melted away. I think we're recording right now just before Christmas. It looks like we will have a white Christmas.
And are you a snow person? Are you from the area? You enjoy the snow? How do you feel about it all?
You know, you can't live in the city without appreciating our snow. We are a beach town in the summer for a good 16 weeks, but the trade-off of now getting out on that lake with ice skates is fun too.
Nice. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great vibe. And are you from the Chicago area originally?
I am. I grew up in the suburbs. I went to school at the University of Illinois in Champaign. I lived in Washington, D.C. for a short time, and then I moved right downtown for my professional career.
Awesome. So when you're growing up in the Chicago suburbs, I imagine you didn't yet have a vision to writing a book about CRO life and private equity life. What did young JD want to be when he grew up?
Yeah. You know, in the Chicago suburbs, everyone is told you're either going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And so when I went to college, I thought I was going to be a lawyer and did an undergraduate really designed to do speaking, thinking, and writing. I wound up doing a degree in communication, philosophy, and comparative literature. But then after an internship, I interned in the Bill Clinton White House. And I realized I didn't want to go to law school. And so that set me off on a different path.
So tell me about that internship, because I was looking through your LinkedIn, and one of the cool things about this interview series is I get to see everybody's first couple jobs. It's always really interesting. But you might take the cake because it says, hey, I worked at the White House. What were you doing there?
It was an interesting time. I worked in the president's office of scheduling and advance. Now, this was the late 90s when, email wasn't even quite there yet. So our office was responsible for organizing the president's daily calendar. And the advance part of the office were people in the field who would go out 3 or 4 weeks ahead of time, wherever the president was going to be. They would fax me maps of where he would show up. And then I would create a kind of a daily book with pictures of here's the room you're going to walk into. You're going to see Kevin. Here's some notes to remind you the last time you met Kevin. Here's what you talked about, and just sort of guided the daily execution of his calendar.
So you were the original AI prep for calendar meetings and scheduling.
Absolutely. And now it's so much better and so much faster. But that used to be all manual effort from interns and fax machines and lots of late nights.
Yeah, I can imagine. So when Calendly came out and simple things like Google Calendar, Microsoft Calendar, you must have had a greater appreciation for that than most.
Absolutely.
So you're in the White House, you have this cool job, but you're deciding you don't want to go to law school. So then what's the next step?
So I was meant to go to law school after that internship ended. And I knew from that experience that I didn't want to be an attorney. For your listeners who are old enough, the Clinton White House interns, we were in the news a lot. And it was a lot of reasons to, not kind of continue that career. So I looked at my degrees and I said, okay, you've got a degree in philosophy. You're not going to be a professional philosopher. You've got a degree in comparative literature. You're not going to be a professional literature comparer. That really just leaves my communication degree. And in the late 90s, the communication school asked me, said you can stay on for a year and work on a master's degree, but asked me if I wanted to work in one of their research labs where, the the research team at that time knew how groups formed in the physical world, and the internet was brand new. And so we were just starting to research how do social networks form online? How do groups develop trust online? How do you build relationships online? And so that's what my master's degree was all about, was kind of looking at how communication that we knew in the physical world would apply to communication online. And shortly after that, I started looking for jobs, and there were all of these .coms springing up in the late 90s who said, you can get a degree in social networking and internet communication. Why don't you come on board? So the first one happened to be a sales engineer job. I had no idea what that meant, but I took the leap and jumped in at a very small .com that grew to be a very large public company.
And so what's that like? You've had this track to law school, then you moved to a really interesting and kind of cutting edge master's program where you're studying the social networks before they're even really a thing that's in practice all the time. And then you become a sales engineer. What is sales engineer life for young JD? Is he surprised by things, challenged by things, or is it kind of click right away?
It was a ton of fun. So part of the communication degree was also public speaking. I had done a lot of speaking classes. I had taught a lot of public speaking classes. And being a sales engineer is being the person who goes and demos the software. So our product at the time was a web content management tool. It's called Introspect. We were ultimately acquired by Vignette. And the sales pitch was sort of, we're calling from the internet. Do you need a website? And back in those days, Vignette was creating the first websites for American Airlines. They were inventing how do you do credit card processing online. They were inventing what would become Amazon's, if you bought this book, you might want to buy this book sort of thing. So I was employee number 26 at Introspect, and was traveling the country going to all of these really cool brand name businesses talking about what their very first websites might start to look like. And momentum built. Our first year, I think we sold about $750,000 of software, which to a young JD felt like a lot of money.
Yeah.
I've never held $750,000, so that's a lot to sell. But 4 or 5 years later, we were acquired by Vignette, who went public with a $9 billion valuation. We were 6,000 employees, and so
Wow.
in a very short span of time, I got to experience this, rapid growth. That said, what's it like to be a tiny startup? What's it like to be a big public company and all the stages in between? And that really clicked with me. And I said, this is what I want to do the rest of my life is, find companies that are going through this sort of journey.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, what an incredible place to be during that time. So, from what I gather on LinkedIn, you kind of then went into and did a couple of things, but one of which was then direct selling, carrying a bag, going from sales engineer to direct selling. Can you talk to me about that transition? What was the intention there, and what did you think of the new role?
Yeah. So, being a sales engineer is fun, but I was always paired with the same sellers. And I looked at what the sellers were doing. And at the time, I thought, the only real distinction, we're going to all the same meetings, we're having the same conversations. The only distinction is I'm not prospecting to set the meeting, and I'm not negotiating the contract at the end. Those seem like two skills that if I could master those, my personal earnings would be so much larger because the commission plans and all the rest of it. And so in my later days at Vignette, I started raising my hand saying, if a territory comes up, I want to, whoops, lost my, let's
You
see, are
go.
we
We
back
got you.
on, we back
Yeah,
there?
we
All right.
got you.
I'll just answer that question again.
So I'll just ask it for you.
Yeah, ask the
You
question again and I'll start it and make sure they're in there really good.
All right. So you're having success as a sales engineer. And at some point, from what I gather on LinkedIn, you transition into direct selling role. What interested you about that transition and what did you think about it?
Yeah. So as a sales engineer, I was paired up with sellers and I kept looking at what they were doing in the meetings. And I thought there's not that big a distinction between my work and theirs, other than, we're going to the same meetings, we're having the same conversations. They have to prospect to get the appointment and they have to negotiate the deal at the end. And as a result, they're making a whole lot more money in commission than I am. And so in my later years at Vignette, I started to raise my hand and say, when the next territory comes up, because we're growing so rapidly, I want to be one of those people. And so I made that transition, started to achieve my quota, and that really launched me off down a path to be a seller. And then following Vignette, I kept looking for opportunities. It turned out they were all owned by private equity firms, small companies that were growing and ultimately getting sold somewhere else. So there was a small startup that we sold to LexisNexis. It was a CRM tool for lawyers. There was a consulting company that was kind of rebirthing themselves in the fallout of some of the Enron things that happened in the early 2000s. And then it's after that, it had been just a series of European companies that were moving to the US or merging with US companies. And I kept becoming sellers and then moved into sales management and ultimately CRO, CMO, CEO of the country kinds of roles.
What was the biggest challenge about the first, maybe the first or one of the sales management jobs that you took? I find that when really strong individual contributors move into their first management role, there tends to be a few wake up moments. I'm curious if any of those happened to you.
Absolutely. I talk about this in my book too. I think it's a very common path for someone who's the top seller to then become the manager of the team, but the skills are completely different. When you're the top seller, you're used to the spotlight being on you. You're used to getting all of the accolades. You're used to kind of charting your own path about how you're going to get there. When you're a manager, suddenly the attention shifts completely away from you. Even when your team is doing really well, You're passing on, the ego and the accolades and everything else. And you actually have to learn how to empower your team to do what you did well. And so I see a lot of first time managers think that I was a great performer. Now I've got 8 people reporting me. They're going to bring me a whole bunch of deals. I'm going to go on those sales calls and I'm going to close them on their behalf. And that's actually, although that's the instinct, because it's the winning formula that got you to where you were that day. To be a really successful leader, you have to do the exact opposite of it. And teach them, get out of the way, let them do some work. I used to work for a leader who had a military background, and he talked about that shift being one that teaches you, let your team make mistakes and try and figure out what are the mistakes that maybe they're just going to lose a finger versus what are the mistakes that they'll lose their whole arm. And I think that the hardest challenge is, and hopefully we don't want people losing fingers either, so maybe that analogy is a little off. Hopefully, uh, hopefully we're finding an opportunity to see an employee that's going to make a mistake and being disciplined enough to sit back and let it happen and let that deal stretch out another week, another 2 weeks, so they actually learn the skill and the lesson that they, won't have to even have you in the room the next time.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, anybody who's had to go through the difficulties of first line sales, it can feel like you're losing a finger. So I think it's a spot on metaphor. So you obviously progress quickly through a number of companies all the way to the executive suite. Can you take me through your personal management arc? You started as this really strong individual contributor, and then you're managing teams that are getting bigger and bigger. You're getting new responsibilities. Marketing comes into the fold. The entire P&L of the business comes into the fold. How do you keep growing yourself so that you can take on these additional responsibilities?
Well, I've been really fortunate that I've had a strong network of mentors, sometimes from my employer and sometimes from outside the business. My first management job really came at LexisNexis, which was that CRM company that got acquired by the big legal publisher. And LexisNexis has about 6,000 sellers. And so they've got a huge training department that identifies growing individuals early on and put me through a year-long management development class that took people from around the globe, from around the business. And I actually had a mentor who wasn't in sales. My mentor was from the product organization that really, met with me every other week. And we talked about how do you motivate teams? How do you do communication? How do you think about the business plan and sort of structure all of that development? And there's a really good foundation that taught me a lot of those kind of early mistakes about, let your team do, don't get in the way of your team, all of those kind of maxims that really set me up, I think, for the following journey. I left LexisNexis to go be the CMO at West Monroe Partners. It's a consulting company in Chicago. And West Monroe had been an implementer of Lexis's software and of Vignette. And so I knew that company really well. And their managing director kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, I know you're a good seller. We have so many clients that have, we got the business from you or your teams. I see you're moving into management and we're starting to build out our sales and marketing engine. I got there, it wound up being a whole lot more marketing than it was sales. And so that was again, an opportunity for me to, humbly say, wow, we're moving in a space I don't know very much about. Let me go find an executive coach, an executive mentor to kind of teach me some of those skills. And then on that foundation, kind of launched the rest of the journey that, wound up being progressively larger organizations that, again, usually were European companies coming to America, where I was the first hire in America or the first leader in America that needed to do some combination of lead sales, lead marketing, and then over time kind of build out the rest of the financial acumen about, how do you report this business as a standalone company or standalone entity that started giving me credibility in the boardroom.
And what was the hardest part of that? I like that story of West Monroe Partners because you're brought in to up the revenue engine, it sounds like broadly or generally, and you realize that that's going to be a lot of marketing work. You don't necessarily know marketing. You mentioned you go and get a mentor. What was the hardest part of developing that skill set, or maybe a challenge that you didn't know about in the world of marketing?
Yeah. I think a lot of, whether it's marketing or whether it's sales leadership in general, it's really shifting from your individual experience to what does the data tell you? And so as a seller, it's really easy to live by your last deal and think that, oh, I lost my last deal on price. And so the entire market, it must be a price problem. Or I lost my last deal to this competitor. And so, boy, we really need our marketing team, our competitive intelligence people to really set us up against that competitor and teach us how to sell there. As a leader, you have to get away from that emotional recency effect and actually look at what are the data telling me. And it may turn out, when you look across a team or you look across a few hundred opportunities that the company pursued in the last 3 months, maybe we only saw that competitor once. And so as an individual, it's really easy to look at kind of your recency experience and extrapolate that to the world. As a leader, it becomes so much more about getting into the data, getting in the spreadsheet, everything that you believe to be true. Can you provide a piece of evidence and provide a piece of data that says this is actually true, not just something anecdotal?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What is the saying? Is data is not the plural of anecdote, I think is what that makes me think of. I'm going to mega fast forward because you did a lot of awesome executive roles, and I'm sure we'll encapsulate them in this next part of the conversation. But I really want to understand what you're doing with the book because it has such a specific angle, which I think is awesome. It's for CROs, it's for private equity. What made you want to write the book?
Yeah. So in my later years, most of my sales and sales leadership have been companies owned by private equity firms. I've been a CRO multiple times in that context. I've been country president in that context a bunch of times. And in the last couple of years, a lot of the private equity firms that I've worked with have started to tap me on the shoulder and say, "Would you mentor someone else?" And so private equity talks about the portfolio of companies that you own. Here, JD, you're the CRO of this company, but hey, there's this other CRO also in the portfolio that might need help on building territories. What do you know about that? Could you do just a quick kind of conversation and coaching and mentorship? And that eventually has turned into my full-time career. So today I work for Five Arrows Capital Partners. They're a private equity firm out of London, and they have 36 companies in the portfolio. And my job is to be the sales and marketing expert for them, that anywhere across those 36 companies, if there's a sales or marketing issue, I'm one of the first calls of here's an expert who might have some advice. And I realized that I kept pulling out the same templates from my bag of tricks about it's annual planning time. Here's how we reallocate territories. Here's how we, reassign quotas. And I kept giving that, advice to the same people over and over. And so I said, I should combine this into a book, and that way I can, share it with our portfolio and make it available to other people too, as just a jumpstart to the conversation. And so that was the genesis of the CRO's Guide to Winning.
Oh, that makes a ton of sense. You wrote the book to scale yourself. You had a lot of these tools in the bag. It sounds like I imagine part of the writing process was also having to codify some of your own ideas that you'd implemented and maybe hadn't put into total written form or total consumable form. Can you take me through that process? Did anything surprise you about codifying your own ideas?
It's really interesting. So it took about a year to write it, and I did it intentionally through a full year of my last year as being CRO at a company.
Hmm.
And so I started in January, or actually kind of the annual planning begins in October. And I said, okay, we're gonna start writing this into a book. Everything I do this year, let's on the side kind of keep track of what is the work I did, what's the template I pulled, what are my thoughts about this? And it really started to develop into the outline of the book is almost every month of the year, starting with designing
Oh,
the plan
wow.
for the year, putting your sales kickoff together, doing your board meetings, doing coaching for sellers, and taking you all the way through to the end so that you should be able to use the book at any point in your journey and say, okay, we're right here. Let's read to the end and start again at the beginning and get the work of CRO done as a result.
I love that. A true operating model. I'm glad to have purchased it because I'm eager to dig in. So maybe if we can, if it's okay with you, I would like to kind of zoom into some of the sections of the book and talk about some of the things that we'll learn in there. So it starts with the beginning of the year and annual planning and a sales kickoff. Can you take me through how you determine, what folks should do for a strong sales kickoff?
Yeah. Well, sales kickoff should reinforce the themes for the year. So, I love to have a sales kickoff. It's one of my favorite things to get everyone in the room and have the fireworks show and, all the events and all of that sort of stuff. But I hope that anyone who's ever attended any of my sales kickoffs have left with one core theme kind of drilled into their head. And that's been different, in different organizations. Sometimes it's a year of building and we have a theme about how we're going to do that. Sometimes it's a year of consistency. And so it's a year about, the kickoff is all about repetition and those sorts of things. But the theme actually starts a little bit earlier from our annual planning process. And I think this is where CROs set themselves up to win or lose, before the first sales call has even happened, is what's the annual number we're going to chase? And how are we going to get there? And this is the work that I'm doing with our Five Arrows portfolio companies. constantly right now, sitting in December. We're wrapping that up. But it's one thing for a CRO to know, okay, I'm supposed to grow this business $20 million next year, and that's our target for the year. The most important part is how do you get to that $20 million and who's responsible for which pieces? And so breaking it down into how much of that is going to be new logo business? How much of that is going to be price increases on our existing accounts? How many of that is going to be new things I'm going to sell to my existing accounts? What's going on in the health of my existing accounts? What customers am I going to lose? Because if I start the year with 100 million, I'm trying to end at 120. I might lose 5 million, I might lose 10 million, and actually have to sell 25 or 30 to bridge the gap. And so really getting specific about that, really getting specific about the shape of the year, and knowing that we're not going to take that $20 million number and just divide it by 12. There are going to be busy seasons and slow seasons and fast seasons. So really kind of planning month by month, what's the revenue for each team that's going to add up to this ultimate end goal, and then using the sales kickoff to communicate that to folks and be able to tell your new logo team, you know what, we're going to start this year out slow, but that new product is launching in June, and then you're going to have like triple the revenue that you had in the first half of the year. Hey, customer success, the first 3 months are going to be really hard because 60% of our clients are up for renewal. And then, here's the stuff that we're going to focus on in the second half of the year. And so the more granular you can get about that, and the more you can track those milestones, the better you are.
That makes a ton of sense. I think the simplicity of starting with the number and breaking it down and becoming thoughtful and specific about that is a great general framework. So you're advising a lot of people on this, and presumably, you've been doing this over your career. Is there something that happens during this process that makes you want to put your head in your hands when folks say, this is my strategy, or maybe my lack of strategy? Like, what's the biggest mistake that you see CROs making in the annual planning cycle?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about hope is not a plan. And, I get really maniacally focused on everything for the next year needs to be able to be on a spreadsheet, on a piece of paper that you can point to exactly how we're going to get there. And I think it's a lot of work, and it drives people crazy to really keep coming back and say, but how, but how, but how. But if you have signed yourself up for a $20 million number and you really only understand 17 million of it, the real tricky part is to not say, well, I hope $3 million is going to come as a bluebird. I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll just sign up and hope it comes. It's really aligning everybody on maybe recognizing we want that 3 million, maybe recognizing we hope it's going to come from someone new we hired, a new product or something like that, but really documenting those assumptions as well so that we can measure, is that bet paying off? Is it not? And what do we do about it?
Now, I understand that there's a story in the book about territory design and how that fits into the business. And I'm probably the main territory design story fanboy, similar to someone who's obsessed with Star Wars. When a new piece of content comes out, I kind of can't wait to get my hands on it. So I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us how territories play into the book.
Yeah. So territories for me are really important because I really want all of my sellers to have an even playing field at the beginning of the year so they all have an equal shot at success. Early in my career, I joined a company that I spoke to the manager who said, I have this top seller. He also happens to be my neighbor and best friend, but he is the best seller in the company. And, he is outselling everyone else. And let's look at the numbers. He's retiring 180% of quota and all the rest of it. And so this is the seller that you need to model your team on. And when I got on board in the first week, of course I met this great seller. I was kind of unimpressed. And I thought, you don't really seem to understand much about the product. You can't really tell me much about, how are you winning? And he had all this sort of vague, like the product sells itself and my sales engineer is really great. And I walked away thinking like, what's your skill? And then I started to dive into territories and I looked at historic data. And that was a product that was really focused on one core industry. And they were just starting to succeed in one core industry. And it turned out that 90% of that industry had headquarters in this seller's territory. And all the rest of the sellers were like trying to divide the last 10% of the market. And so when you looked at all the other sellers, they were good people. They had great talent. They had great skill, but they didn't have a fair opportunity to succeed. And so that year, we reallocated the territories and we divided it evenly across all 10 sellers. And what happened? That guy who was supposed to be the best actually turned out to be the lowest performer of the year because he was just sitting and he was collecting all the bluebirds, where all the great sellers, once they were given an even playing field or an even opportunity, they got more deals done, they closed more, they won more, they closed bigger deals, and they used less resources of the company to do it. And so that lesson really taught me then through the rest of my career that when we do annual planning, we really need to start looking at what's our total addressable market and how do I evenly divide the pie so that I've got an appropriate number of sellers with an appropriate number of opportunities trying to get there. Because once you do that, then the fine distinctions about who a really good seller is and what's a good skill start to come through really clearly.
That makes a ton of sense. And so you talk about very specific planning. You talk about the importance of thoughtful territory design. If I'm playing devil's advocate, so now it's September, right? And the market is changing, or we've lost people. And in the territory example, now I have to change my territories, or I have to change an element of the plan. How do you deal with the balance of sticking to what the plan was and the ethos of that plan versus adjusting for conditions on the field?
Yeah, this is actually a place I'm really curious to learn from your leadership because I know this is what you guys special in. As an operator, this is one of the hardest things because the emotion of territory change is really hard. I try not to move people's territories. I try not to do it more than once a year. Actually, I try not to do it more than once in a hold period. But exactly as you said, you can get to September and realize something fundamentally has shifted in the market. We've had an acquisition where there's a lot more people, or we've had a big exodus of sellers. And the reality on the ground of your sellers is, I don't feel like I have great opportunity here. And I like the stability of my territory. And so I'm actually really curious how you guys help navigate that
Yeah.
because I also know that the logistics, if you're not using a great technology, is really hard to, it's a lot of crazy spreadsheets and it's hard work to adjust on the fly.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm happy to kind of get into it. I think fundamentally, territory planning tends to have two problems. One is that the process doesn't have a home. So if I'm a salesperson or a sales leader, I tend to think that this whole process is bunk because I can't participate in it in an easy way. I don't know how my territory was designed. It was given to me. And there was no messaging. Got these spreadsheets and they were confusing. I wasn't able to offer my input about why I think the data are bad, things of that nature. But then there's this second piece, which is that there's actually an incredible amount of work going into designing your territory thoughtfully and trying to put you in a position for success. So the sentiment should actually be the opposite. It should be a team one. And so what we built is a suggestion engine for the operations team to do the process much more quickly, much more quantitatively, and add an operational layer to make it smoother so that everyone can participate. But for us, it's about just really codifying what the process is and kind of lifting the curtain on the whole thing so that the sales team knows, okay, like this is something that I'm part of,
I
and
understand how you got there.
taking it away from behind the veil.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. One of the things I know about leading salespeople is we tend to be the most emotional people in the company. And especially when it comes down to how am I making money? What's going to impact my paycheck, my commission? You get a lot of emotion and you get a lot of opinions about that. And so I think you're
Absolutely.
exactly right that the more transparent you can be and how you got there, why you got there, the better.
Yeah, I basically started the company because I was an emotional salesperson who wanted answers. So I totally resonate with that. Well, so then let's talk about some of the other themes in the book. I would imagine that as an advisor to other CROs in a private equity business, you have to think about new technology that's on the horizon. How do you counsel other CROs to say, you have to be aware of what's coming, but you also have to be functional in the day to day?
Yeah. I think it's really important to have a really good pilot. Everyone is talking about AI right now, and we hear all of these promises about, the AI that's going to listen to every call and prompt you with cues, and the AI that's going to design your next message and write your emails and do your follow-ups. And we're seeing some of those technologies are working really, really well. But when we first started to hear about them 2 years ago, they were completely unproven. And some of the technologies we heard about 2 years ago are no longer with us. And so when we think about an annual plan and we think about the year ahead, I'd like to have a base case of what we know we can do if we made no changes to the business at all. And then let's make some strategic bets with, okay, let's carve out a little bit of budget or a little bit of a team or a little bit of a trial here, see what that technology looks like and see how it works. And if it proves itself, then great. The next quarter or next half, we can amplify that and we can readjust our plans up. I don't like to see plans that begin with, I need a magic 10% improvement on performance. This AI vendor has told me that they're going to do 15, And so we just wrote into our plan from the beginning of the year without any kind of evidence to prove that it worked for us.
What do you think it is about the private equity style of operating that agrees with you as a person?
I never get bored and it's constantly new projects. I sort of describe private equity as kind of house flipping. They come along, they buy a company that's got really good bones. They're going to hold it for 4 years or 5 years. They're going to make improvements. They're fixing up the kitchen, they're adding the new technology to make sales work. And then they're going to sell it to someone else who's going to continue the journey. And that really does well with me because it results in a lot of little projects that are like, can get in, I can do some things in the first year, in the second year, the third year. And then, when it's operating really well, I'm not a person who can just sit and keep putting quarters in the machine and have it keep running. I'm ready to move on to the next challenge. And so as a CRO in a private equity company, it always meant that, every 4 years, we're going to get a new owner, we're going to do something new. And now as an advisor, I've got 36 of them that, I constantly get to kind of shift my brain from what's this company's problem, what's this company's problem, and how can we help them be the best that they can be with the unique skills and talents and circumstances they're in. So it's so much fun.
What a beautiful way to stay on your toes. I love that. So we're running out of time. Now, if someone hears this conversation, they're going to say, okay, JD interned in the White House, then very quickly became a sales leader, very quickly became a marketing leader, very quickly became an executive to the point where he's now counseling other executives and writing a book. Very cool career that still has a lot going for the rest of it. But they might want to say, how do I do that? And what advice would you give them?
Say yes to every opportunity. I think I got here because at every turn, something new and unproven was presented to me. And I said, yep, I'll try that. And we'll see where it goes. Now, it hasn't been a string of consistent successes. We could have spent the last hour talking about every failure that I've had, or I've been fired from jobs too along the way, but constantly looking at an opportunity and being brave enough to say, it's a little unfamiliar to me, it's a little bit new, but I'm gonna step into it and say yes and try. And then looking for mentors and coaches and people who maybe have been there and done that in the past and ask for their advice and help. I was fortunate that in Chicago, there is a senior executive, actually from Unilever and the Elizabeth Arden Company, who retired into Chicago and became one of my neighbors. And, we had a 35, 40-year age gap. And for whatever reason, he took me under his wing and said,
Awesome.
let me teach you about my life. And finding those sorts of people really, has been what's allowed me to succeed.
Where did you, so that is a very positive kind of outlook on trying new things. And I find that those who go from sales engineer to then wanting to try sales seem to have that. Like that's the same kind of thing that comes up for you throughout your career that you mentioned. Where does that initially stem from in childhood? Were you always ready to try new things? Is that something your parents instilled in you? Did you develop it later in life?
I actually think about the speaker on the first day of university. They call it freshman convocation, I think. And I remember the convocation speaker saying to my incoming freshman class that 75% of you are going to be in jobs that don't yet exist today by the time you graduate. And this was in the 90s when the internet was just happening. It was totally true that we came into school thinking doctor, lawyer, engineer. And 4 years later, we have email, we have web browsers, e-commerce, all of this stuff. And so I think it's been that realization that the world is constantly changing. And just about the time you get good at doing something, the context has shifted and there's another new thing that you're going to have to adapt to or learn how to do or be willing to try. And it's sort of proven out in my personal experience.
Well, good for you. And shout out to the University of Illinois for having a speaker that impacts the kids on day one. That's
Absolutely.
Good stuff. JD, thanks so much for this conversation. I hope you have a beautiful, snowy holiday season in Chicago. The name of the book is The CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity. You can pre-order now on Amazon, and we'll link this in the show notes because I know by the time it comes up, the other copies will be available too. So thanks so much for doing this. We'll look forward to doing another one in the future.
Thanks so much. Appreciate having me.